Hello, my name is Will.
And my name is Ellie.
Welcome to Lively Minds, the podcast about mental health challenges that go beyond the ebb and flow of the everyday.
The podcast that looks at how building a better understanding of our mental health can influence how we address it.
Today we are talking about high-functioning depression with Dr. Judith Joseph.
Dr. Judith Joseph is a globally recognised board-certified psychiatrist, researcher and media contributor. She is the founder and chief investigator at Manhattan Behavioral Medicine, assistant professor in child and adolescent psychiatry at NYU and chair of the Women in Medicine board at Columbia University.
Judith's book, High Functioning, Overcoming Your Hidden Depression and Reclaiming Your Joy, is published by Square Peg, which is part of Penguin Random House. Based on the world's first clinical study on high-functioning depression, the book demystifies a condition where individuals appear to function well in day-to-day life, but privately struggle with a lack of pleasure alongside masochistic behaviours.
Welcome to the show, Judith. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I thought we'd kind of go straight into discussing the DSM slightly. So to varying extents, both the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases. So they're the two that are most likely to be used for drawing out diagnoses. Both of them refer to a lack of functionality as being either a diagnostic criteria or a consequence of mental disorders. So in light of us being about to explore high-functioning depression, I wondered what's your view on the place of someone's ability to function in terms of determining whether or not they have a mental health condition that requires or deserves attention?
Yes. In my lab, I study all sorts of mental health conditions from schizophrenia to ADHD to depression. And what I found was that a lot of folks were coming in with this picture of depression that wasn't the typical picture. They, according to the DSM, after a list of symptoms, at the very bottom, you have to meet criteria for either lacking functioning or being in significant distress. So when I have clients who come in and they have these symptoms of depression, like changes in their appetite, changes in their energy, changes in their concentration, Anhedonia, which is the lack of interest, pleasure in things that they once enjoyed. And sometimes, the low mood, the depressed mood, if they don't meet criteria for the full picture, meaning that the symptoms are impairing functioning or they're in distress, they don't get a diagnosis. And, for people who are looking to have a better life, not just to meet the status quo, that can be very deflating because many times they're struggling with anhedonia, a lack of joy, pleasure, interest, and they don't even know what it is. They have no idea that it's a symptom. And they find themselves blaming themselves, like, why can't I be happy? What's wrong with me? So I thought, why are we waiting for people to lose functioning? Let's train people how to identify these signs of depression so they don't have a breakdown, so they don't lose functioning. In mental health, we're so reactive, but in physical health, they're more proactive. There's this whole boom of preventative care. People are saying, let's train people how to catch the signs of cancer before you get to stage 4. No one's saying, let's wait till we get to stage 4 and then we'll do something.
We'll see what we can do.
Yeah. But in mental health, we do wait. We tend to wait and wait for breakdowns. But seeing what we're observing over the past 5 years, this mental health crisis that is global, largely due to the pandemic and the aftermath of that, we're seeing that if we wait for people to break down, we're just not going to have the capacity to help people. We have to prevent it. So that's my take on it. It's a different lens. It's a different approach. It's more proactive than reactive, but I think it's what we need, especially with the rising rates of mental health issues in children. Children are the rates are going up in children, going up in adults. So we need to address this before, we just don't have the capacity to do anything about it.
Yeah. And how do you, in terms of the way that you talk about it in your book, how do you define high-functioning depression?
So folks with high-functioning depression, according to the clinical research study that I conducted, the first study in the world to be peer-reviewed, I was pretty surprised about that when it got published and the editor said that they couldn't find any other studies. The way that we defined it was We use the same diagnostic criteria for clinical depression. So you'll see the list of criteria in my book and also in the paper that was published. But you have these symptoms of depression, and you're meeting criteria for at least 5 or more of them, but you're not breaking down. In fact, what you're doing is you're coping by overworking. You're busying yourself. And, when we spoke with these individuals in the study, they didn't know what it was that pushed them to like cope by being busy. They didn't understand it. But our hypothesis was that we would do an inventory, not just of depressive symptoms, but we'd also look at trauma, past traumatic experiences. And when people hear trauma, they think like, well, what is trauma? Well, we collected experiences that were both like the typical traumas, like, violence, combat, assault, all those things, life-threatening things. But we also collected other things that, are not classically thought of as traumas. Things like, were you neglected? Did you not have resources growing up, like food? Did you go through experiences with individuals in relationships where they were verbally abusive, right? According to the DSM, that does not count as a trauma, right? But therapists in the real world know that is traumatizing. If you're partnered with someone who like belittles you and degrades you for years, you start to have these fight or flight responses. But according to the textbooks, that's not a trauma because your life wasn't at risk. So I collected all of these experiences, put them in the trauma inventory to see if there was a correlation between folks who identified as having high functioning depression and past traumas. And what we found was there was. And so the theory was that people cope with past pain by busying themselves. So these are folks that when they're sitting still, they feel restless. When they're not working, they feel empty. So they cope with this pain by not sitting still. So on the weekends, this is someone who's not relaxing. They're cleaning out the garage. They're taking on a side hustle or two. They just can't relax. They can't sit still. They're busy to avoid. Whereas when you think about classic PTSD, classic trauma, what people tend to avoid are things like places, people, situations, so they don't get triggered. Folks with high functioning depression, they avoid dealing with their pain by continuously being busy. And so, it's one study. I hope there'll be more, but it was really eye-opening, I think, for a lot of the participants to kind of understand maybe how they ended up this way, why they're this way.
Yeah.
Anhedonia was something that many of them had never heard of. So having a name for what they experience is really powerful. And, anhedonia is something that's in clinical depression, the depression that we know of, where you break down, you don't get out of bed. Anhedonia is a symptom that you can have that and not be sad to meet criteria for depression. So I think a lot of people think, depression is sadness, crying. But you don't have to be sad or seemingly depressed to meet criteria for clinical depression. You can have anhedonia and not low mood and all the other symptoms. And as long as they're impairing your functioning, you meet criteria. So, even, the idea of not being sad to meet criteria for a clinical depression is something that came out of this research because I don't think people knew what anhedonia was. Especially in the US, it's not a common word here. I think it's more used in the UK. So, the research is important. I think that it allows people to identify what's happening in their experiences so they can actually do something about it before they break down. Before we hear these stories of like, I had no idea this person was struggling because they looked all put together.
Yeah.
Well, we know that depression looks different in different people. And if we just are looking for one picture, then we're going to miss out a whole bunch of people who are struggling.
You were saying it's the first kind of study that you're aware of in high functioning depression. And I wondered, did you come up against much resistance within the medical and academic community when you were either putting the study together or afterwards when you were going through and publishing it?
Well, before I started this clinical study, when I started talking about high functioning depression, people were saying, that's not a thing. Why are we focusing on that? Let's focus on clinical depression a lot. And then after I published the study, they were like, oh, this is really important. We should be doing this more. And so now and that's why research is important, because it validates an experience. Because if you are not able to actually show that this is a condition, or this is maybe a condition, or this is an experience people are having, and here's the data that shows it. If you can't do that, then people don't take it seriously. And that's why research is so important across any condition. We need to study it. We need to talk to people. We need to validate people's experiences, and we need to quantify. You know how I said the human brain, we don't do well with the abstract. If you show us some numbers, we feel safe, And so that the study actually has been very well received, and people want more. So I'm really pleased about that.
Could you unpack a little bit more the roles that anhedonia and masochistic behaviours play in high-functioning depression? I noticed that in your book you refer to them as sort of two of the pillars, in a sense, of high-functioning depression.
Yeah, so many people end up in my office and they're not saying, I'm not functioning, but something's off. They're saying everything's fine, but something's off. And then I'll give them the anhedonia questionnaire to see what they mean by that. Because again, it's such a vague, it's a vague experience. And, our brains are developed to quantify. Our human beings need to see things in order to accept them, right? That's how we use money. That's how we use numbers. The abstract stuff, that's where we struggle, And so the questionnaires are very powerful tools because they allow you to put a number to a feeling. And so something that's very concrete to something that's abstract. And so when people do complete the anhedonia scale, they'll answer questions such as, when I ate my food, did I savor it? Was it yummy? Or did I just kind of shove it in and I don't remember what it tasted like? When I rested and took a nap, did I wake up feeling refreshed? Or was it not pleasurable? People don't think about all these human experiences as being at points of joy. But in the research, that is exactly how we measure happiness. We're asking about these human experiences, like when you ate, did you savor it? When you took a nap, did you feel well rested and refreshed? When you were lonely and you reached out to a loved one, did you feel seen and connected? Did you feel heard? When you were stressed, were you able to soothe? Stress is something that we measure in depression research, and I don't think people understand that. And the reason that we measure it is that it's really, really hard to access joy when you're stressed out. I don't know very many people who are super stressed and joyful. Yeah. It's very, very difficult, right? So all of these points of experiences in the human life, that's how we actually measure joy and happiness in the research. But I think most people in the real world think of happiness as just one experience, like a smile, like, oh, happy. But actually in the depression research, we actually add up all of these sensations of being a human to see how much joy you're getting out of it. And that's how we can tell if you're becoming happier. So I wanted people to understand that so they could actually put that's why I feel this way. I'm not getting joy out of these basic human experiences. And that's why I'm not happy. And once you're able to identify that, then you know how to address it. It's way more doable than I just want to be happy one day, right? It's so abstract. Yeah. And in my private practice, my therapy practice, which is the traditional like talk therapy, medication management, patients will come in and say, I want to be happy. Well, then when I'll ask them, well, what does happiness mean to you? They'll say, oh, well, I guess it's when I get my dream career, or I guess it's when I get that partner that I always wanted. It's always this thing, right? This destination. And you're dependent on the external. You're dependent on things happening in the world for you to become happy. Whereas joy is more internal. It's like, how do I become intentional about squeezing this pleasure out of these experiences that are innately human experiences? And many of us leave our joy points on the table. We'll eat our food in front of a laptop and not savor it. We'll go the whole day with tension in our bodies, stressed out, not even use the bathroom. We're leaving all these little basic pleasures on the table, and then we wonder why we're not happy. So when you retrain your brain to access those tiny moments of joy and then you start intentionally grabbing those points throughout the day, then you actually start becoming happier. So it's not this grand destination, it's these moments that really matter.
I imagine there's something about time in that as well for some of your patients. I can imagine it being quite shocking, possibly, for some of them to realise how long, because thinking, well, no, today I didn't because I had this meeting and so it was a particularly stressful day. But actually thinking, well, okay, when was the last time I experienced, for some of people with high functioning depression, it'd probably be quite a shock to realise that it might have been a very, very, very long time ago.
Yes.
That they felt like this for ages. And
yes, for sure. I recently gave a talk at this large institution, and then and I got a DM from one of the people who attended, and she was saying, like, I didn't even realize how I just sit at my desk all day. I'm so stressed out. I'm so tense, and I don't even like validate it. I don't acknowledge it. I just push through. And during that particular talk, I had taught them one of these tools to identify the tension in their body and just to pay attention to it and just like intentionally relax those muscles, because many of us walk around with so much body pain. We don't even acknowledge it. We just push through. And then she said she started just doing that 5 minutes a day, just being intentional about relaxing those muscles. And then she was like, I just felt better. I felt joyful. She was like, now I know what you mean by joy. But she just never put the two and two together. You know, she was thinking, well, I'm in this great job and everyone says I'm doing well. But then why am I not happy? And she was just missing out on just like validating how, you know, the job is great, but two things can be true. It's also very stressful. Yeah. So let's like take these moments in the day just to calm that tension and pay attention to the mind-body connection and just like slow down. Those tiny moments made a difference. So it's not about all or nothing thinking. It's not about, well, I'm just going to, you know, give up my high functioning ways and just, you know, be this person that I'm not. Yeah. It's more about acknowledging how these tiny changes add up to becoming happier. And over time, when you start to incorporate it and you get better at it, it really makes a difference.
Hello, it's Will here, just taking a short break to firstly say hello to any new listeners who may have dropped by, and to ask everyone listening right now, if you are enjoying the conversation and haven't done so already, could you do something for us? Could you pause the episode just for a moment and give us a rating or review in your podcast app? I promise we won't go anywhere. Ellie and I do this show in our spare time, so it really means a lot to get the feedback. Done? Brilliant. And also, make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss future episodes, which are released once per month. Okay, now back to the show. And how about the role of the masochism aspect of that as well? The sacrificing one's own well-being for others, the feeling like you need to keep going no matter what. What role does that play?
Yeah, so masochism is a controversial term. It was initially in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I think back in the 80s, and it was removed when they were revamping for version 4. And it's controversial because often when it was used to assign blame to women who were finding themselves in these abusive relationships. The old criteria for masochistic personality disorder included things like you incite others to treat you poorly. Like there's something about you.
Oh, okay.
Almost like victim blaming. Like there's something about you that's making others treat you poorly. But there were other traits within masochism, like not feeling worthy of praise, bending over backwards to please others, you know, delaying gratification and all these things. So, you know, when you peel out the bad parts of masochistic personality disorder, what you're left with something that we consider today as people pleasing, which is not a medical term. It's not in any DSM. But we wouldn't say that people pleasing doesn't exist. We all know what people please are, right? It's just not, there's just not a good term for it yet because masochism was essentially problematic. But I wanted to bring it back, not just because it's a really interesting, you know, tidbit of psychiatric history, but also because I want people to understand that this was something that was like once really studied, you know?
Yeah.
Similar to like things like imposter syndrome, they're not in any diagnostic manuals, but we know it exists. And so understanding people pleasing and how that shows up in high functioning folks, if you think about it, it makes sense. If you're someone who doesn't acknowledge their past pain, who delays pleasure, who's constantly busy, you're going to be doing for others. You're going to be overperforming for others. And other people are going to see that and take advantage of it. Unfortunately, human beings, when we see an opportunity for us to be selfish, we take it. That's just human nature. It doesn't mean that the people in your life are bad people, but people take when they're getting for free. And so I wanted people to understand that many times, when you're not aware of what you're running from, you end up in these situations where they're not, the best situations for you, especially if you've come from past trauma. One of the symptoms of trauma is not feeling worthy and internalizing shame and blame. And what that does for you, unfortunately for your behaviors, is that you end up seeking out situations where you can be validated by the external. So where people will find worth in you. And you end up in these roles sometimes where you're just doing so much for others that you believe that that's your worth. Your worth is only tied to this role. So people do take advantage of you. And so the masochism there is, you're showing up for others, you're bending over backwards, you're not thinking about your joy, you're prioritizing others. And before you know it, this is who you are. You don't even know how else to behave in relationships. And you're surrounded yourself with people who are takers. But there is hope. You can change, but change requires acknowledging this pattern. That is actually not healthy for you. So
masochistic behaviours, I thought that the term masochism always implied that you got some pleasure from whatever these behaviours are. Does it not have to include that?
No. So there's sexual masochism, and then there's masochistic personality disorder. So sexual masochism is, whatever floats your boat. No judgment there, but masochistic personality disorder is very different than that.
So you don't have to I don't mean sexual pleasure, I mean like joy or almost from exhibiting these behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because by definition, personality disorders cause distress and impairment.
Yeah.
And you talk about small t trauma and big T trauma in the book as well. And that was really interesting because we're aware, of of an increasing tendency for people to start trying to think about understanding psychological distress sort of through more of a trauma lens. Over here in the UK, we've got the power threat meaning framework that is very much along those lines. And I hear very differing opinions on it. I hear people talk about, is there a risk of underplaying capital T trauma by talking about small t trauma? And does talking about small t trauma mean that we're all looking for trauma where it may not exist? All that kind of stuff. Could you unpack what you mean by capital T compared to small t trauma and what your research found was its role within high functioning depression?
Yeah, the capital T trauma, this is the trauma that's actually recognized in the typical medical literature. And it's in no way meant to minimize, that type of trauma because it's significant. And you need standardization in order to be able to do these studies across the world. That being said, the other traumas are actually being studied as well. So in the US, there's something called the ACEs questionnaire, and it looks at childhood experiences.
Yeah, I was reading about that.
Yes, it's been around for over 10 years now, but there have been modifications to it. Looking at these childhood adverse events that lead to negative outcomes like poor health, lower salaries, lower socioeconomic standings, and so forth. And so some of the modified ACEs are including things like, did you not have enough food growing up? Were you neglected emotionally? Things that would not make it into the big T traumas that are typically in the textbooks. But we know that they are important. They are significant in terms of shaping how you view the world, how you interact with others, how you see yourself in the world. So they're significant in the way that they shape you emotionally and psychologically. And so those are included in my inventories. I don't think anyone would, again, in the real world say things like, oh, like you growing up without food didn't shape you and it wasn't traumatizing, right? I do think there's a risk of calling everything a trauma, right? Like you go and you see these like exaggerated claims of like, you were on the job for one day and someone treated you poorly, so you're traumatized. Like, no, that's not how trauma works. There are always going to be people who cherry pick how they want to assign certain words. But I do think that, most mental health specialists and experts would agree that there are certain things that are traumatizing that maybe don't make it into the textbooks. Like divorce can be traumatizing. It's actually in the ACEs questionnaire. A lot of times divorce has so many layers to it: psychological abuse,
financial abuse,
infidelity, financial scarcity. Like there's so many layers to it. So I think that we do need to expand our knowledge as to what leads to trauma responses, because people can have these trauma responses of like shame, blame, fight or flight, hypervigilance to things that are not classically considered, textbook traumas. And, these trauma responses interact with this individual in ways that may cause issues with the way that they behave in the workplace, at home, in their relationships, and even just on a physiological level. And so, there's this big argument within the purist community of what a trauma is, but most mental health professionals will acknowledge these traumas that are little t, because we see how it plays out in our patients' lives. And we see it in real time. We don't even, there's no argument as to how this, impacts patients every day and their families.
And in your view, the way that big T and little t traumas exhibit in high functioning depression, is that kind of like what you were saying earlier about how we're used to thinking about people with something like PTSD living their life in such a way that they avoid triggers in order to not have really awful experiences. And in high functioning depression, you can think of it as people actually just avoiding the pain altogether by busying themselves, so there's no sort of chance for the triggers to pop in. Or
yeah, that's a theory.
Yeah.
It's one study, but that is our theory that, that's your way of coping. You just keep going.
Yeah.
In my practice, people are like, I just don't even know why I keep going. And then when we unpack it, it's like, I'm running from something. Yeah. I literally am running. They think they're chasing happiness, but they're trying to outrun their past. And it can be life-changing for a lot of folks, like to realize, oh my gosh, I never acknowledged that, ever. Maybe I didn't want to on an unconscious level, but I never consciously acknowledged it, or I didn't want to think about it. When you slow down and you start to process it, sometimes my clients will they'll cry. And I say, that's good. That's okay. It's all right. There's a fear that this all or nothing thinking, I'm going to fall apart. I'm not going to function, but it's the opposite.
Did you find that was quite common in your study? Because I had very high functioning depression, and I did take a breakdown to kind of really reassess it properly in terms of how I live. But definitely when I'm thinking back like 10 years ago, whenever, that was definitely my viewpoint. I was like, I can't stop and address this stuff, because if I do, I'll completely disintegrate and won't be able to function at all. So whilst I understand that I'm just like over functioning, I don't, it is all or nothing. And obviously that's not true. Mm-hmm. But did you find that was common?
In my practice, yes, because my study did not have a treatment component to it.
Yeah.
But definitely with my patients, there is a deep fear of, if I just acknowledge this, I'm going to break down. It actually does not happen.
No.
The opposite happens. You start to feel joy again, because you're acknowledging what happened to you. You're not blaming yourself. You're taking the steps to heal. And you're showing yourself you're worthy of the healing, and that you're worthy of like getting pleasure out of life. And so the opposite ends up happening. What I've seen is that when people don't acknowledge their pain, they keep pushing through, they keep, invalidating their experiences, is that something breaks down eventually. Either they physically break down, or they do end up having a clinical depression, or they end up coping in unhealthy ways, excessive substances, excessive behaviors that are not healthy for them. So again, this is really important to acknowledge this, unpack it, process it, and to heal so you don't have a breakdown.
So in your book, you have developed a sort of framework. Could you summarize your 5 V's, your 5V framework, which is validation, venting, values, vision, and vitals?
Yeah, so when I thought about the 5 V's, I wanted to think about a very simple way to approach joy based on evidence-based practices around happiness and the science of happiness. So, I want people to realize that, there's only one you, and there will only ever be one you. And that to me is just, whenever I have patients who are severely depressed, I say that. And then, a lot of times they'll say, wow, like the chances of me being here are so small. I'm here for a reason. So when you think about the science of your happiness, look at your hand, and most of us have 5 fingers. That's why I chose 5 for V's. But, tell yourself that I'm built with the DNA for joy. And I just sometimes I forget how to reclaim it, and just really envision yourself reclaiming it and tap into one of the 5 V's every day. Don't do all 5 because that's too much. But the first V is validation. This is important because you know how I said a lot of times we just go through a day, we don't even acknowledge what we're feeling. We just push it down. Validation is so important in accepting and acknowledging how you feel and what you're experiencing. And I describe validation as, when you're in a dark room, imagine you can't see anything, it's pitch black, and you hear a loud crash. Some of us would just start screaming, some would start running, some would start, swinging the air, punching the air. But if you turn the light on and you see that, oh, it's just something that fell, I'm safe. That's what validation is. It's like turn the light on your emotions so you know what you're dealing with. And naming your emotions and your experiences accurately is important. A lot of times people come in, they'll say, oh, I'm angry. But when we peel it back, they're actually very anxious. So if you know what you're dealing with, you know what to do. So self-validate when you can. The second is venting. Venting is expressing your emotions in a healthy way. So in my lab, people will come in and I'll give them this red balloon, and each person will take a turn trying to dunk this red balloon in a tub of water. And 100% of the time that balloon pops up. Why? Because you can't outmath physics. So what we'll do is we'll then take turns deflating the balloon. And then once it's deflated, you can easily put that balloon at the bottom of that tank. And this is how our emotions are. If you express how you feel slowly over time, then it won't pop up in your health, and it won't pop up in your relationships, and it won't pop up in your home life. You will be able to deal with your emotions in a healthier way. So venting can be verbal venting. And if you verbally vent to a therapist, you can do what you want because you're paying that therapist. But when you verbally vent to a loved one or someone in your life, you really have to vent with intention. And the research is showing that if you're not venting with intention, you're actually going to feel worse. So when you vent with intention, you're not venting just to get someone on your side. You're venting with the mindset of, I'm going to get a solution to this issue that I'm dealing with. And I'm going to be empathic in terms of who I'm venting to. I'm not going to vent to my kids because they're in a position of lower power than me. That's not a fair dynamic. I'm not going to vent to my employees because they're not going to argue with the boss. They're just going to listen and resent me. You want to vent to 1 or 2 people who, there's reciprocity, and you want to ask for emotional consent and say, hey, is this a good time to talk? Don't want to overwhelm you. Like, I really need to talk to you about something. So you want to vent with empathy, intention, and with emotional consent. And then venting doesn't have to be verbal. You can vent by writing in a journal. You can vent by praying, by crying, like just getting the emotions out in a way that feels authentic for you in that moment. And then the third is values. Values are things that are priceless, not with the price tags. So this one is tricky for a lot of my clients because they're so busy chasing that idea of happiness that they're leaving the joy on the table. But when you think of your values, what are things that make you feel meaningful, purposeful? When you're on this earth for the last 5 minutes of your life, what are the things you're going to want to do, right? You're not going to be like, I want to buy another purse. You're going to be like, oh, I'd like to spend time with my pets or my family or the cause that I felt strongly about, So if you can figure out what your values are and try and anchor yourself to those, that is evidence-based to increase your happiness in life. And then the fourth V is vitals. Vitals are things that you do to support your body and brain. And so, when you think about how do you support your body and brain? Well, these are things like getting good movement in, eating foods that are not inflammatory foods for your brain, that are not processed, getting rest, like making sure you're mindful about your sleep hygiene, not being on the phone before bedtime, thinking about the relationships in your life, because if you're partnered or you're around toxic people, they are literally draining your life force, and thinking about your relationship with technology, because we're seeing a lot of data now that shows that that's not healthy for your brain. So these are ways to support your body and brain, because you only get one. And then the last V is vision. How do you plan joy in the future so you don't get stuck in the past? So, for many of us, we're just on the go, on to the next. And I used to be like this, after like one podcast, I'd be off to another. But now I pencil in these little breaks in between, and I will go down to the coffee spot downstairs, get a matcha. That's my little reward. And I'm like, I did that. I did that meeting and I saw a patient and I did a media appearance and I'm going to reward myself. I am a human being, not a human doing. These small gifts that you do for yourself, they go a long way. Remember those moments, they add up. So when you do something, be it big or small, make sure you're celebrating your wins and you're planning joy in the future. We need that. It gives us hope. So those are the 5 V's. And, you tap into one of them, every day and one or two, and, really tell yourself that you're worthy of joy. It's built into your DNA. But, really what you want to do is understand the science of your happiness, because there's only one you. There's only ever going to be one you. So what are the areas in your life where you're losing joy? Yeah, those are the areas you want to think about. We're also busy chasing this idea of happiness. We don't even realize we're losing our present joy. And that's where you want to focus your efforts.
A fantastic spot, I think, to finish the conversation on. So thank you so much to our guest, Dr. Judith Joseph, for joining us. Judith's book, High Functioning, Overcoming Your Hidden Depression and Reclaiming Your Joy, is published by Square Peg and is available to buy now.
Thank you for listening, and please do tune in again next month for another episode of Lively Minds, the mental health podcast.
Please note that this show does not constitute medical advice and is not a replacement for seeking professional help. You can find signposting to support on our website at livelymindspod.com.
Make sure you keep up to date with our shows by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.
Take care and bye for now.
Bye-bye.